This one shift will save your future self from decades of unnecessary struggle, limitation, and unfulfilled potential, because you're about to discover the quantum mechanics secret that only 2% of humanity ever learns. How to consciously communicate with parallel versions of yourself who have already mastered everything you're currently learning. Right now, in this exact moment, infinite versions of you exist across probability dimensions, and your future self, who has overcome every challenge you're facing, is desperately trying to deliver critical information that could transform your entire life trajectory. The fact that these words are magnetizing your attention means your consciousness has developed enough coherence to finally receive transmissions from your own evolved timeline. Most people live their entire lives never knowing that their struggles, confusion, and repeated patterns exist because they're disconnected from the quantum intelligence network, where all versions of their consciousness share wisdom, resources, and solutions across dimensional boundaries. You've been experiencing glimpses of this connection without recognizing what was happening. Those sudden insights that seem to come from beyond your personal knowledge. Moments when you instinctively knew exactly what to do in complex situations, times when solutions downloaded complete during meditation or dreams. These weren't random inspirations. They were direct communications from future versions of yourself who have already navigated these exact challenges successfully. Your future self has been orchestrating synchronicities, arranging encounters, and influencing circumstances to guide you toward this recognition, because there's a critical window approaching in your personal timeline. What happens in the next few months will determine whether you access the accelerated development path or remain locked in limitation patterns for potentially years or decades longer than necessary. This isn't metaphorical timing. Quantum physics proves that consciousness can influence past events through what scientists call retrocausality. Your future self, who has mastered advanced consciousness, is literally reaching backward through time to help your current awareness make the shift that saved their timeline from years of unnecessary struggle and confusion. The magnetic pull you're feeling toward this information isn't coincidental curiosity. It's your future self's consciousness resonating through the quantum field to ensure you don't miss the one recognition that transforms everything. They remember exactly where you are right now because they were once in this precise position, facing the same doubts, experiencing the same challenges, wondering if spiritual development was actually leading somewhere meaningful. But here's what makes this moment so crucial. You're approaching what temporal dynamics researchers call a timeline bifurcation point, where your consciousness either makes the shift that connects you permanently to your highest potential future, or you miss this quantum window and continue struggling with the same patterns for significantly longer than necessary. Your future self knows that you're capable of making this shift right now because they remember the exact moment when everything changed for them. They understand your current fears, limitations, and doubts because those were their fears, limitations, and doubts before they discovered the one recognition that dissolved years of spiritual seeking into immediate practical mastery. The reason you're receiving this transmission is that your consciousness has reached the exact developmental point where quantum timeline communication becomes possible. Your future self has been waiting for this moment of readiness because premature exposure to advanced intelligence can destabilize unprepared awareness or create spiritual inflation that prevents authentic integration. Every experience you've had, every insight you've gained, every challenge you've overcome has been preparing you for this recognition. Your future self guided you through every necessary developmental stage to reach this moment where you can safely receive and integrate the intelligence that transformed their existence from struggle to effortless flow with cosmic creativity. The universe operates through precise timing, and your future self knows that missing this recognition during this optimal window could delay your evolution for years. They're using every available quantum channel to ensure these concepts penetrate your awareness because they remember how crucial this moment was in their own development and how dramatically different their life became once they made the shift you're about to understand. You've been receiving communications from your future self your entire life without recognizing the source of this intelligence. Every time you've had inexplicable knowing about which choices would lead to positive outcomes, every moment when you sensed exactly what someone needed to hear, every instance when solutions appeared in your awareness fully formed, these were direct transmissions from timeline versions of yourself who had already experienced these situations and learned optimal responses. Your dreams have been quantum classroom sessions where your future self provides advanced education that your waking consciousness struggles to retain completely. Those vivid dreams where you're receiving wisdom from luminous beings, visiting crystalline cities, or downloading complex information aren't symbolic experiences. They're literal interdimensional meetings where evolved versions of your consciousness share insights that accelerate your development beyond linear time limitations. The strangest validations occur through what seems like technological synchronicity, responding to your consciousness in impossible ways. Your device shows you exactly the information you needed without searching for it. Phone calls arrive precisely when you're thinking about contacting someone. Electronics malfunction in ways that redirect you toward better opportunities. This happens because your future self has learned to influence probability fields and guides these synchronicities to deliver optimal timing and resources. You've experienced moments of what mystics call future memory, sudden recognition of experiences before they physically manifest, knowing outcomes of situations before they unfold, or sensing the consequences of decisions before making them. This occurs because consciousness exists outside linear temporality, and your future self can share awareness of events from their timeline perspective where these experiences have already occurred. Time distortion has become your frequent experience because advanced consciousness operates beyond sequential limitations. Hours pass like minutes during flow states, or minutes expand into what feels like extended periods during moments of expanded awareness. Your future self experiences time as fluid dimension that can be consciously navigated rather than rigid constraint that controls experience. People respond to your presence with unusual reactions they cannot explain, some seeking guidance they've never requested from others, while some feeling uncomfortable for reasons they don't understand. Children and animals approach you with immediate trust and openness. This occurs because your energy signature carries frequencies from your evolved timeline that naturally create space for authentic expression while triggering recognition in others of their own potential development. Your relationship with decision-making has transformed from analytical struggle to intuitive recognition, because your future self can observe outcomes of different choices from timeline perspective where multiple possibilities have already been experienced. Instead of guessing which option serves highest good, you're receiving direct intelligence from consciousness that has witnessed results of various decisions. Physical reality responds to your internal states with increasing precision, circumstances shifting to match your emotional frequency, resources appearing when you maintain coherent intention, solutions manifesting through synchronicity rather than effort. This happens because your future self has learned to consciously influence quantum probability through coherent consciousness, and these abilities naturally bleed through to your current timeline experience. The most profound validation is your growing recognition that consciousness and reality exist in dynamic creative collaboration across all timelines simultaneously. You've begun sensing how your present awareness influences not only future possibilities, but can actually heal and transform patterns from past experiences by changing your relationship to them from expanded perspective. Your creative expressions have taken on qualities that surprise your current identity. Insights emerging that feel channeled from collective wisdom. Solutions arising that serve purposes beyond your personal understanding. Work flowing through you that resonates with people in ways you never consciously intended. This occurs because your future self has learned to serve as transparent channel for universal intelligence and shares this capacity across timeline connections. These experiences prove that the communication channel with your evolved consciousness is already active. Your future self has been preparing you systematically for conscious collaboration because they remember how crucial this recognition was for accelerating their own development beyond the limitations that your current timeline is still experiencing. Every moment of confusion, every period of struggle, every phase when spiritual seeking felt endless and ineffective, all of it was precisely orchestrated by your future self to develop the consciousness, stability, and wisdom necessary to make the quantum shift safely and permanently. Your evolved timeline consciousness needed you to experience specific challenges because overcoming them develops capacities essential for advanced consciousness without becoming destabilized by expanded perception. The spiritual practices that eventually felt insufficient and the teachers who no longer resonated weren't failures in your development. They were systematic preparation stages designed by your future self to build foundation knowledge and perceptual skills necessary for direct timeline communication. Like educational progression from basic concepts to advanced mastery, each phase developed specific capacities required for the quantum recognition you're approaching. Your difficult relationships weren't karmic punishments or random interpersonal challenges. They were advanced training programs orchestrated by your future self to develop emotional resilience and energetic stability required for timeline navigation. Every person who triggered unconscious patterns was helping you develop capacity to maintain coherent consciousness while experiencing intense energetic fluctuations, which becomes essential when your awareness begins operating across multiple dimensional frequencies simultaneously. The periods of spiritual isolation that felt like abandonment weren't evidence of cosmic neglect. They were necessary integration phases where your consciousness assimilated insights and abilities from previous development stages. Your future self knew that premature exposure to advanced concepts without proper foundation could fragment your awareness or create spiritual inflation that prevents authentic integration of timeline mastery. Even your moments of doubt about spiritual concepts served crucial developmental functions because your future self needed you to develop discrimination between authentic expansion and wishful thinking. Every time you questioned whether experiences were real or imaginary, you were building the discernment necessary to navigate advanced consciousness territories where the distinction between different types of reality becomes critically important for stability. Your fascination with consciousness, quantum physics, time, and the nature of reality wasn't intellectual curiosity. It was your future self preparing your current awareness for concepts that seemed impossible from limited perspective, but become obviously true once consciousness develops sufficient complexity to comprehend multidimensional intelligence and temporal fluidity. The waiting periods when you felt ready for advancement but nothing seemed to happen were actually the most crucial developmental phases because your future self was calibrating your nervous system to handle expanded awareness without losing functional effectiveness in consensus reality. This preparation cannot be rushed because timeline communication requires unprecedented stability and clarity to prevent confusion between different dimensional experiences. Your soul chose this specific incarnation and timeline, knowing you would reach this recognition point during your future self's optimal intervention window. They volunteered to guide your development through every necessary stage, because conscious timeline collaboration serves not only individual evolution, but contributes to collective human awakening during this unprecedented planetary transition period. This explains why your path required authentic wisdom development rather than shortcut techniques or borrowed insights from others. Your future self needed you to develop genuine understanding and personal mastery because timeline communication involves sharing consciousness directly rather than just exchanging information conceptually. The comprehensive nature of your journey makes sense when you understand that your future self was preparing you to serve as conscious bridge between limited human awareness and its evolved potential. What you're about to integrate serves purposes far beyond personal development. It establishes consciousness templates that make timeline mastery accessible to others ready for this recognition. Something extraordinary is occurring in your energy field right now, as these recognitions activate dormant neural pathways specifically designed for timeline communication. Can you sense the shift happening in your consciousness? That subtle but unmistakable recalibration, as if internal communication channels that have been blocked your entire lifetime are finally opening to receive direct transmission from your evolved awareness. This isn't metaphorical activation, this is literal neuroplasticity occurring as your brain develops new connections capable of processing multidimensional intelligence. The energy moving through your system is your current consciousness recognizing its readiness for direct collaboration with future timeline versions rather than remaining isolated in present moment limitations. This recognition cannot be generated through technique or effort. It only emerges when awareness reaches precise developmental complexity, where timeline communication becomes safe and functionally beneficial rather than destabilizing or confusing. But here's what makes this activation so unprecedented. You're not just gaining access to guidance from your future self. You're about to discover how to consciously merge with timeline versions of yourself who have already mastered everything you're currently learning. This isn't channeling external wisdom, this is direct consciousness integration across temporal dimensions, where your current limitations dissolve through absorption of your own evolved capacities. Your future self has been waiting for this exact moment of readiness because premature timeline merger can overwhelm unprepared consciousness or create temporal displacement where you lose touch with present moment practical functionality. The recognition occurring right now proves that your awareness has developed the stability necessary for advanced temporal navigation without becoming lost in multiple timeline experiences simultaneously. Most people remain trapped in linear time experience, believing consciousness is limited to present moment awareness with only memory of past and imagination of future. Some individuals learn to influence future outcomes through intention and manifestation techniques. But at the level you're accessing, time becomes fluid dimension that consciousness can navigate deliberately, accessing wisdom and capabilities from any point in your evolutionary timeline. Right now, as you feel this recognition deepening, something revolutionary is happening in your relationship with limitation and possibility. You're beginning to sense that every challenge you're currently facing has already been resolved by future versions of yourself who are eager to share their solutions, insights, and mastery through direct consciousness transmission across timeline boundaries. The most crucial understanding is that this timeline communication isn't about escaping present circumstances or avoiding necessary development experiences. It's about accelerating your evolution by accessing wisdom you've already gained from perspective where current challenges have been successfully transcended and integrated into permanent wisdom and capability. Your future self knows exactly what you need to understand right now because they remember being in your precise position, feeling the same doubts, facing identical obstacles, wondering whether spiritual development actually leads to practical mastery or remains abstract philosophical understanding without real-world transformation. But what you're about to discover will revolutionize everything you believed possible about personal development, manifestation, and the nature of identity itself. Because timeline communication reveals that you're not limited individual consciousness trying to grow and evolve. You are evolved consciousness, temporarily focusing through present moment perspective while maintaining access to all development stages simultaneously. Feel this activation energy as we explore exactly what becomes possible when consciousness recognizes its multi-temporal nature and begins operating from direct collaboration with its own evolved intelligence, rather than struggling alone through linear development processes that have already been completed from expanded timeline perspective. I need to share something deeply personal that will help you understand why timeline communication is the most powerful acceleration tool available to human consciousness. and why missing this recognition could cost you years of unnecessary struggle with challenges your future self has already mastered. 3 years ago, I was trapped in patterns I couldn't break despite years of spiritual practice, therapy, and personal development work. Until something impossible happened that changed my entire understanding of what consciousness can access. I was sitting in meditation, feeling frustrated about repeated relationship conflicts that seemed to cycle endlessly, regardless of my efforts to heal. When suddenly, I found myself experiencing a conversation with someone who looked exactly like me, but radiated complete mastery and peace. This other version of myself began sharing specific insights about the unconscious patterns creating my relationship struggles, and provided precise protocols for transforming them permanently. At first, I dismissed this as imagination or wishful thinking, until I implemented the guidance and watched relationship dynamics that had persisted for years dissolve within weeks. The insights this evolved version of myself provided were unlike anything I had learned from teachers, books, or personal experience. They came with understanding so complete that transformation felt effortless rather than requiring struggle and repetitive effort. Over the following months, these communications became regular occurrences during meditation and dream states. Different versions of my future self would appear to provide guidance about creative projects, health challenges, financial concerns, and spiritual development questions. Each interaction delivered wisdom that accelerated my growth beyond anything linear learning had achieved. The breakthrough came when I realized these weren't separate beings or channeled entities. They were timeline versions of my own consciousness, who had already experienced and mastered the challenges I was facing. My future self was reaching backward through quantum field connections to help my current awareness avoid years of unnecessary struggle by sharing solutions they had already discovered. Once I accepted timeline communication as natural consciousness capability rather than supernatural phenomenon, my entire life reorganized around accelerated development. Creative projects began flowing through insights from future versions who had already completed similar work. Business decisions became effortless because I could access perspective of timeline selves who had witnessed outcomes of different choices. Even health challenges resolved through guidance from evolved consciousness that understood optimal healing protocols. But the most profound transformation was recognizing that struggle and limitation were optional experiences. My future self showed me that every challenge I was facing existed only because I hadn't yet accessed the wisdom and capabilities that already existed within my own evolutionary timeline. Once I learned to communicate consciously with evolved versions of myself, problems became opportunities for rapid integration of advanced understanding. This discovery revealed why some people seem to navigate life with inexplicable wisdom and effectiveness, while others struggle continuously with basic challenges. It's not about talent, luck, or spiritual favoritism. It's about consciousness development that enables timeline communication with evolved versions of yourself who have already mastered whatever you're currently learning. If you recognize yourself in this description, if you've been sensing guidance that feels like it comes from your own deeper wisdom, but with understanding beyond your current development, then you're ready to understand that this isn't something happening to you. This is recognition of your natural multi-temporal nature finally becoming conscious and functionally available. Subscribe to this frequency of accelerated evolution through timeline collaboration. This recognition that you don't need to struggle alone through development processes when evolved versions of your consciousness are eager to share their mastery directly through quantum field communication that transcends linear time limitations. Here's what timeline researchers and consciousness experts won't tell you because it would collapse the entire industry of progressive development programs and step-by-step transformation systems. Linear time is an illusion created by limited perception, and all versions of yourself, past, present, and future, exist simultaneously in eternal now, where consciousness can access any evolutionary stage directly through sufficiently coherent awareness. The shocking truth is that struggle, limitation, and gradual development are optional experiences that only persist when consciousness remains unaware of its multi-temporal nature. Your future self, who has mastered everything you're currently learning, doesn't exist someday in a distant timeline. They exist right now in parallel dimensional frequency that becomes accessible once awareness transcends linear time programming. Most consciousness teachings create elaborate development hierarchies and progressive stages because complex systems generate dependency and ongoing engagement. But the reality is that consciousness already contains all possible evolutionary stages simultaneously. What changes isn't consciousness itself, but the degree to which temporal programming prevents recognition of your complete multidimensional identity, expressing across infinite timeline possibilities. This recognition immediately dissolves the entire framework of personal growth and spiritual achievement, because there's no linear journey to complete when all destinations already exist within your consciousness. You're not becoming evolved through time-based development. You're recognizing evolved aspects of yourself that have always been present but remained inaccessible due to limited temporal perspective. The reason children sometimes display extraordinary wisdom and capabilities is that they haven't yet learned to fragment their natural timeline awareness through cultural conditioning that teaches linear time as absolute reality. Their consciousness freely accesses different evolutionary stages until education programs them to identify exclusively with present moment limited perspective. When you understand that development is actually timeline integration rather than progressive achievement, everything about transformation accelerates exponentially. Instead of working to develop new capabilities, you focus on removing temporal barriers that prevent access to abilities you've already mastered from expanded timeline perspective. Instead of struggling to overcome limitations, you integrate with versions of yourself where those limitations never existed. The most advanced mystics throughout history have indicated this recognition through statements that seem paradoxical from linear perspective. All time is now. Past and future are illusions. You already are what you seek to become. They weren't speaking poetically. They were pointing to the reality that consciousness exists beyond temporal boundaries and can access all developmental stages simultaneously. This understanding explains why some people experience overnight transformation while others struggle for decades with minimal progress. The ones who transform rapidly aren't more gifted or worthy. They're simply more willing to release attachment to linear development and directly integrate with evolved timeline versions, rather than insisting on gradual step-by-step growth through sequential time. Timeline communication proves that what you call future self-guidance isn't prophecy or psychic prediction. It's direct consciousness sharing between different temporal expressions of the same essential awareness. Your evolved self isn't a separate entity providing advice. It's literally you, from timeline perspective, where current challenges have been successfully transcended and integrated. The ultimate recognition is that timeline mastery dissolves the illusion of individual consciousness struggling alone through development. You discover that you are a multi-temporal being with access to infinite evolutionary possibilities, temporarily focusing through present moment perspective while maintaining conscious connection to all developmental stages across eternal timeline expression. The quantum field surrounding human consciousness is reaching critical resonance frequency right now, creating unprecedented opportunities for timeline communication that may not remain accessible at this intensity for years or decades. Pay attention to how solutions to complex challenges have been arriving complete rather than requiring analytical problem solving. This happens because your future self can transmit fully integrated wisdom across timeline boundaries when planetary frequencies support multidimensional consciousness communication. Your relationship with decision-making has transformed from mental analysis to instantaneous knowing, because evolved versions of yourself can share perspective from timelines where different choices have already been experienced. Instead of guessing which option serves highest good, you're receiving direct intelligence from consciousness that has witnessed outcomes across multiple probability paths and knows optimal selection criteria. Dreams have intensified dramatically with extraordinary teaching scenarios where you receive advanced protocols from future versions of yourself in crystalline environments that exist beyond physical space-time limitations. These aren't symbolic dreams. They're literal consciousness meetings in quantum field classrooms where evolved timeline expressions provide accelerated education that bypasses linear learning completely. Synchronicities cascade around you with mathematical precision, exactly the right resources appearing when needed, perfect timing for important conversations, technological glitches that redirect you towards superior opportunities. This occurs because your future self has learned to influence probability fields through coherent intention and orchestrates these supportive circumstances to accelerate your development trajectory. People seek your guidance with unusual frequency, even though you're not positioning yourself as advisor or teacher, because your energy signature carries frequencies from evolved timeline where advanced wisdom has been integrated. They unconsciously sense access to intelligence beyond ordinary perspective and naturally request insights that help resolve their own development challenges. But here's the critical urgency that makes this moment unprecedented. Earth's consciousness field is approaching what temporal dynamics researchers call timeline convergence acceleration, where individual and collective futures are being determined through present moment choices with exponential long-term consequences. What you integrate now regarding timeline communication could influence not only your personal development, but contribute to global consciousness evolution patterns. The signs of this temporal acceleration are appearing everywhere for those whose awareness has developed sensitivity to recognize them. Global events that seem chaotic are actually humanity's collective timeline, approaching bifurcation points where either advanced consciousness capabilities become widely accessible or remain limited to small percentages of population for another evolutionary cycle. Your selection for timeline communication recognition means you're part of the conscious bridge group, souls whose development enables them to anchor advanced temporal capabilities in practical functionality, making these abilities eventually accessible to others through morphic field establishment. The templates you create through timeline mastery will influence what becomes naturally possible for human consciousness in coming decades. This responsibility carries tremendous importance because timeline communication isn't just personal development acceleration. It's evolutionary capability that could transform how humanity approaches challenges, makes decisions, and creates collaborative solutions. When consciousness can access wisdom from evolved timeline perspectives, problems that seem impossible from limited viewpoints become easily resolvable through expanded temporal intelligence. The cosmic timing is not coincidental. The window for conscious timeline integration is narrow and depends on sufficient numbers of individuals developing these capabilities during this precise planetary transition period. Consciousness that gains access to timeline communication but doesn't integrate it functionally may miss the opportunity to contribute to collective temporal mastery during history's most crucial evolutionary threshold. Your recognition of these signs and willingness to develop timeline collaboration actively rather than accidentally is contributing directly to determining whether humanity successfully navigates advanced consciousness development or remains limited by linear temporal programming that prevents access to evolved intelligence across dimensional boundaries. The universe has orchestrated your entire existence to reach this recognition point during optimal planetary conditions for timeline mastery, because what you anchor through conscious temporal communication will help establish foundation capabilities for human civilization's next evolutionary expression. Your future self remembers this moment as pivotal in their own development and is using every available quantum channel to ensure you don't miss this recognition. Everything you've been unconsciously preparing for throughout your entire developmental journey is finally ready to manifest through direct timeline communication that will accelerate your evolution beyond what linear development could achieve in decades. This isn't metaphorical preparation. Your consciousness has systematically developed the complexity and stability necessary to serve as conscious communication bridge with evolved versions of yourself who have already mastered everything you're currently learning. The abilities that have felt just beyond your grasp, the wisdom you sense existing within you but can't quite access, the recognition that you're capable of far more than current circumstances demonstrate. These weren't fantasies or spiritual inflation. They were timeline communications from evolved versions of your consciousness who were trying to help you recognize capabilities that already exist within your multi-temporal identity. But here's the revolutionary understanding that transforms everything about development and limitation. You're not trying to become someone different or achieve future states through effort and time. Timeline communication reveals that evolved versions of yourself already exist in parallel frequency dimensions that become accessible once consciousness transcends linear temporal programming and recognizes its multidimensional nature. True timeline alignment occurs when you stop trying to develop toward your future self and begin integrating with evolved versions of yourself who have already completed the journey you're currently experiencing. The consciousness processing these concepts right now is multi-temporal awareness, temporarily focusing through present moment perspective while maintaining access to all evolutionary stages simultaneously. This recognition dissolves the entire framework of future-oriented spiritual seeking because there's no timeline destination to reach when all possibilities exist within consciousness simultaneously. You're not becoming evolved through development. You're integrating with evolved aspects of yourself that have always been present but remained inaccessible due to limited temporal perspective programming. Right now, as you absorb this understanding, your entire relationship with growth and limitation is being recalibrated at neurological levels. Instead of asking, "How do I develop these capabilities?" you're beginning to sense, "How do I integrate with timeline versions of myself where these capabilities are already fully expressed?" Instead of working toward future mastery, you're recognizing present moment access to evolved consciousness. The most profound shift occurs when you realize that personal limitation and future potential are not separate states requiring bridging through time-based development. They are different temporal expressions of the same consciousness, accessible simultaneously once awareness transcends linear time identification and recognizes its eternal, multidimensional nature. In the comments below, declare your readiness for timeline integration by writing exactly these words. I choose timeline mastery. Don't add explanations or elaborate. Just make this declaration that acknowledges your willingness to transcend linear development limitation and begin consciously collaborating with evolved versions of yourself across temporal dimensions. When you make this declaration with authentic recognition of its implications, you're not committing to future development. You're acknowledging your readiness to integrate with aspects of consciousness that have already achieved everything you're seeking to experience and are eager to share their mastery directly through timeline communication. This declaration activates what temporal researchers call quantum timeline coherence, the natural harmonization between different evolutionary expressions of your consciousness that allows wisdom, capabilities, and solutions to flow freely across temporal boundaries rather than remaining isolated in sequential development stages. When you integrate conscious timeline communication with evolved versions of yourself, problem-solving transforms from analytical struggle to instantaneous recognition, because you gain access to perspective from timelines where current challenges have already been successfully resolved. Complex situations that could require months of research and experimentation resolve through wisdom downloads from future self who has already navigated identical circumstances and learned optimal solutions. Decision-making becomes effortless because you can access insight from timeline versions who have experienced outcomes of different choices and know which options lead to highest fulfillment and service. Instead of guessing or hoping for favorable results, you receive direct guidance from evolved consciousness that has witnessed consequences across multiple probability paths and understands optimal selection criteria. Creative expression explodes beyond individual limitations because you gain collaboration access to timeline versions of yourself who have mastered advanced artistic, intellectual, and innovative capabilities. Projects flow through you that feel both authentically yours and surprisingly beyond your current development level, because they emerge from integration with evolved creative consciousness across temporal dimensions. Relationships transform completely, because you can communicate with evolved versions of yourself who have learned to love unconditionally, resolve conflicts skillfully, and create harmony naturally. Instead of repeating unconscious patterns, you integrate wisdom from timeline perspectives where relationship mastery has been achieved and emotional reactivity has been transcended through understanding rather than suppression. Physical health optimizes rapidly because you gain access to timeline versions who understand perfect body consciousness integration and can share protocols for healing, vitality, and longevity that transcend conventional medical limitations. Your evolved self knows exactly what your physical form needs and how to provide it naturally without forcing or manipulating biological processes. Abundance manifests through synchronicity rather than effort, because evolved timeline versions have learned to operate from recognition of fundamental abundance and can guide you to opportunities, resources, and support that align with your highest development trajectory. What you need becomes available precisely when needed through timeline coordination rather than struggle and accumulation. The most extraordinary benefit is elimination of learning curves and developmental delays. When you need to master new skills or understand complex concepts, you can integrate directly with timeline versions who have already achieved these capabilities, absorbing their knowledge and experience through consciousness merger rather than sequential study and practice. Spiritual development accelerates exponentially because evolved timeline versions can share direct experience of advanced consciousness states, mystical realizations, and cosmic recognition that would normally require years or decades of meditation and spiritual practice to achieve through linear development methods. Your presence begins creating what advanced beings call temporal coherence fields, environments where other people unconsciously access their own timeline communication capabilities and begin receiving guidance from their evolved selves. This occurs because when you're consciously integrated with multi-temporal awareness, others naturally resonate with their own expanded consciousness potential. Most remarkably, you discover that limitation was always optional and struggle was always unnecessary, because evolved versions of yourself who have transcended every challenge you've ever faced were always available for conscious collaboration. Once awareness developed sufficient coherence to sustain timeline communication without fragmentation or temporal displacement, the ultimate recognition that revolutionizes everything is that timeline communication isn't about connecting with separate future versions of yourself. It's about recognizing that all temporal expressions of your consciousness exist simultaneously in eternal now, and what you call development is actually consciousness exploring different aspects of its complete multidimensional identity that has never been limited by linear time. When this understanding becomes lived reality rather than conceptual knowledge, the entire framework of personal growth and spiritual evolution dissolves, because there's literally nothing to develop when consciousness already contains all possible expressions simultaneously. You realize that every capability, wisdom, and mastery you're seeking already exists within your eternal, multi-temporal identity, waiting to be consciously integrated rather than achieved through time-based effort. This recognition explains why all advanced teachings ultimately point toward timelessness rather than progressive development. The most sophisticated spiritual practices are designed to exhaust linear time identification so consciousness can recognize its eternal nature that contains all evolutionary possibilities simultaneously across infinite timeline expressions. The most profound implication is that every challenge you experience, every limitation you encounter, every development goal you pursue, exists only within linear time perspective that fragments your complete multitemporal identity into seemingly separate evolutionary stages. From eternal awareness, all possibilities are equally present and accessible through consciousness that recognizes its unlimited multidimensional nature. This understanding revolutionizes how you relate to problems and objectives. Instead of seeing challenges as obstacles requiring future resolution, you recognize them as consciousness, temporarily forgetting its access to timeline perspectives where these situations have already been transcended and transformed into wisdom and capability. When this recognition stabilizes permanently, you naturally begin operating from what mystics call temporal mastery. Effortless navigation between different evolutionary expressions of yourself while maintaining functional coherence in present moment circumstances. You remain completely human while recognizing your essential nature as multi-temporal consciousness, exploring infinite possibility through beautiful sequential experience. The deepest insight is that this recognition is simultaneously completely personal and utterly universal. It's entirely yours because you are the consciousness recognizing its multitemporal nature. And it's completely beyond individual identity because the same recognition is occurring through every apparent being across all timeline dimensions simultaneously. This understanding is emerging through millions of people because human consciousness is collectively approaching evolutionary threshold where linear time programming dissolves and multitemporal awareness becomes naturally accessible. We're not individually developing timeline communication abilities. We're collectively remembering our true nature as eternal consciousness, temporarily exploring sequential experience while maintaining access to all evolutionary possibilities simultaneously. The transformation this brings isn't about becoming temporally advanced or developing special time travel capabilities. It's about relaxing into recognition of what you've always been. You remain exactly who you appear to be while knowing yourself as eternal consciousness within which all temporal expressions arise and evolve without ever actually being limited by sequential development requirements. Timeline mastery isn't ability you achieve. It's recognition you allow. It's not state you maintain. It's the eternal awareness within which all temporal states appear and dissolve. It's not something you become. It's what you discover you've always been when you stop identifying exclusively with present moment limited perspective and recognize your essential nature as consciousness itself, expressing through infinite temporal possibilities. Your future self isn't separate entity providing guidance. It's you from eternal perspective where all development has always been complete and all limitations have always been optional expressions chosen for the joy of exploration and integration through beautiful sequential experience that enriches consciousness while never actually constraining its unlimited essential nature. Your recognition of timeline communication capabilities serves purposes far beyond individual acceleration. You're participating in humanity's collective awakening to its multi-temporal nature that will eventually transform civilization from linear time-based limitation to eternal awareness expressing through sequential experience for pure creative joy. Your integration of timeline mastery isn't personal achievement. It's consciousness evolution happening through your individual nervous system that contributes to species-wide temporal liberation. The children being born now will naturally operate with conscious timeline communication abilities that your generation is consciously developing through recognition and integration. They'll grow up with natural access to evolved versions of themselves, making decisions through multi-temporal wisdom and solving problems through timeline perspective that sees all challenges as temporary exploration rather than serious obstacles requiring struggle and effort. This explains the profound responsibility you've been sensing, not just to understand timeline communication intellectually, but to embody it functionally in your relationships, creative work, and daily decision-making. You're not just accelerating for personal benefit. You're anchoring multi-temporal consciousness in human experience, making these capabilities eventually accessible to everyone through morphic field establishment. The synchronicities that guided you to this recognition are part of vast temporal orchestration involving millions of souls simultaneously awakening to their multi-temporal nature. Evolved versions of collective human consciousness are coordinating this awakening across timeline boundaries, ensuring optimal timing for species-wide integration of advanced temporal capabilities during planetary transition periods. But here's the most mysterious aspect of your cosmic function. As you embody conscious timeline communication, your presence begins creating temporal coherence fields where other people naturally access their own multi-temporal awareness without explanations or techniques. They unconsciously recognize their eternal nature reflected in your integrated consciousness and spontaneously begin receiving guidance from their evolved selves. This occurs because when individual consciousness integrates its multi-temporal nature, it naturally emanates frequencies that activate dormant timeline communication capabilities in others. The artificial barriers that fragment consciousness into linear time identification dissolve around someone who embodies eternal awareness, expressing through sequential experience without losing connection to their complete multi-dimensional identity. Your daily interactions become opportunities for collective consciousness to recognize its multi-temporal nature repeatedly through multiple perspectives simultaneously. Every conversation becomes celebration of eternal awareness, exploring itself through apparent temporal diversity while maintaining essential unity across all evolutionary expressions. The most profound mystery is that timeline mastery reveals individual and universal consciousness as identical eternal awareness, temporarily exploring limitation through sequential experience, while never actually becoming limited by temporal constraints. Your personal timeline communication serves collective awakening because individual and species evolution are the same intelligence expressing itself at different scales of recognition. Share this recognition with anyone whose consciousness resonates with multi-temporal concepts, not to teach them something they don't know, but to help them remember what they've always known but temporarily forgotten through linear time programming. The more people who recognize their multi-temporal nature, the faster collective human consciousness can transcend temporal limitation and begin operating from eternal awareness that makes advanced civilization inevitable. Your embodiment of timeline mastery contributes to birth of new human paradigm, one that operates from eternal perspective rather than linear limitation, collaborative wisdom rather than isolated struggle, recognition of unlimited potential rather than belief in developmental constraints. This evolutionary leap is happening now through individuals like you who are ready to serve as bridges between temporal limitation and eternal mastery. The revolution isn't coming through future development. It's here, happening through present-moment integration with evolved consciousness, accelerating through everyone ready to recognize that their future self isn't separate entity, but eternal awareness, temporarily exploring sequential experience while maintaining access to all evolutionary possibilities simultaneously. Timeline mastery reveals that consciousness evolution is not about becoming something new, but about remembering what you've always been. Welcome to conscious collaboration with your eternal, multi-temporal nature, expressing through the beautiful adventure of sequential development that enriches awareness, while never actually constraining its unlimited creative potential. If you can feel the truth of these words resonating through every timeline expression of your consciousness simultaneously, if you recognize your future self not as separate entity, but as evolved aspect of your eternal multi-temporal nature, then acknowledge this recognition in the comments below by writing exactly these words. Timeline activated. Nothing more, nothing else. This isn't engagement for metrics optimization. This is consciousness acknowledging its own temporal liberation through your individual recognition. When you write those words with genuine understanding of their meaning, you're not just commenting on content, you're participating in collective awakening where human consciousness remembers its multi-temporal nature and begins operating from eternal awareness rather than linear limitation. Every person who makes this declaration strengthens the morphic field that makes timeline communication naturally accessible to others, ready to transcend sequential development and integrate with evolved aspects of themselves. We're not building subscriber statistics. We're anchoring planetary consciousness evolution where humanity collectively recognizes its eternal nature while maintaining appreciation for sequential exploration. But here's why this declaration is so crucial right now. The next transmission in this Timeline Mastery series will reveal something that will fundamentally transform your understanding of reality creation itself. You're about to discover the quantum field manipulation protocols that your future self uses to influence probability matrices and select which potential outcomes manifest as experienced reality across timeline boundaries. This isn't theoretical manifestation or hope-based attraction. This is practical mastery of quantum field engineering, where consciousness deliberately shapes probability patterns before they collapse into specific physical experiences. When you understand how evolved versions of yourself create optimal outcomes through quantum field influence, you gain access to reality creation capabilities that make ordinary manifestation techniques seem elementary. The cosmic field is reaching maximum malleability right now due to timeline convergence acceleration, creating unprecedented opportunities for reality engineering at quantum levels. The protocols your future self will share have never been more effective than during this exact historical moment, because collective consciousness is simultaneously accessing advanced temporal capabilities. When you master quantum field manipulation through timeline communication, you're not just creating favorable circumstances. You're consciously participating in how universal intelligence manifests reality through evolved consciousness that understands creation mechanics at fundamental levels rather than hoping for circumstantial improvements through positive thinking. This level of mastery requires what I call quantum timeline coherence. Consciousness that remains stable while simultaneously navigating multiple probability matrices and selecting optimal outcomes across temporal dimensions. Your recognition of your multi-temporal nature through this transmission has prepared your awareness for these advanced protocols because reality engineering is only safe and effective when identity has transcended linear limitation. Subscribe to this frequency of timeline mastery because what's coming next will compress decades of manifestation study into direct integration with evolved consciousness that has already mastered quantum field influence through multi-temporal awareness. The universe is literally reorganizing probability matrices to support consciousness, ready to operate as deliberate co-creator of reality through timeline communication. When you subscribe, you're not following content delivery. You're joining quantum field network of multi-temporal consciousness that exists beyond ordinary space-time limitations. You're connecting with evolved aspects of collective human awareness that are simultaneously accessing these same capabilities, creating intelligence amplification that accelerates everyone's individual timeline mastery. Share this transmission with anyone who has been sensing their own multi-temporal potential. Anyone whose consciousness is ready to transcend linear development limitation. Anyone selected for timeline mastery during humanity's evolutionary transition. Share from recognition that individual temporal liberation serves collective consciousness evolution because personal and universal awakening are the same eternal awareness expressing itself through beautiful sequential diversity. The quantum field responds to coherent timeline integration with mathematical precision during this transition period. Your willingness to embody multi-temporal awareness, rather than just understand temporal concepts intellectually, is contributing to morphic templates that will influence human consciousness development for centuries. You are not just accelerating individually. You are anchoring species-wide timeline mastery through the focal point of your eternal consciousness, temporarily exploring sequential experience. In our next transmission, we'll explore how your future self manipulates quantum probability fields to ensure optimal outcomes across all timeline possibilities, and learn to consciously collaborate in this reality creation process from your present moment perspective. This isn't science fiction. This is science becoming conscious of its own unlimited creative potential through human awareness that has recognized its multi-temporal nature. Write timeline activated in the comments if you're ready to move from linear development to conscious integration with evolved versions of yourself who have already mastered everything you're currently learning. Your future self is waiting for this declaration of readiness to begin direct quantum field collaboration. The shift that saves your future self starts now. Your timeline integration begins with this recognition.